In June of 1812, a man who had never truly lost a battle made the worst decision of his life. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and at the age of 42, he had already accomplished what no European ruler had managed in over 1,000 years. He had conquered most of the known world, not through luck, not through inheritance, through the sheer, brutal force of his own genius. He stood at the center of an empire stretching from the Spanish coast to the borders of Poland. 40 million people answered to him. The finest generals of the age served under him, and his army, his Grande Armée, was something the world had never seen before and would never quite see again. 680,000 men, 20 nations marching under one flag. Veterans of Austerlitz, of Jena, of Wagram, soldiers who had crossed mountains and deserts and frozen rivers and had never, not once, been stopped. And Napoleon believed, with the complete, unshakable certainty of a man who had been proven right too many times, that Russia would be no different. He was wrong. Catastrophically, historically, irreversibly wrong. And this is the story of how the greatest military mind in European history walked into the one trap he could not think his way out of. By the summer of 1812, there was only one major power in Europe that had not submitted to Napoleon: Russia. And Tsar Alexander I, young, educated, proud, and stubborn in ways that Napoleon consistently underestimated, had done something unforgivable. He had reopened Russian ports to British trade, defying the continental system, defying Napoleon's direct orders, defying the man who had humiliated every other monarch on the continent. Napoleon's response was fury. His advisors urged caution. The campaign against Russia, they said, would be different. The distances were too vast, the supply lines too long, the Russian winter too dangerous. His most trusted marshal, Berthier, called it madness. His foreign minister, Talleyrand, resigned rather than support it. Even Napoleon's own brother Jerome, who would command part of the army, wrote to him privately, begging him to reconsider. Napoleon dismissed them all. He had done this before, ignored the doubters, silenced the cautious, and been proven gloriously right, while everyone else looked like fools. He saw no reason to believe this time would be different. He would cross into Russia. He would force a decisive battle. He would dictate peace terms from Moscow. He would be home before the first frost. 6 weeks, that was his estimate. 6 weeks. On the 24th of June, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. It was the largest military force ever assembled on European soil. Soldiers stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. Infantry, cavalry, engineers, artillery, supply wagons. The crossing alone took 3 full days. The soldiers were in good spirits. The officers were confident. Napoleon himself rode among the columns, reviewing his men, radiating the absolute certainty that had carried them from Paris to the gates of every capital in Europe. And then, almost immediately, something went wrong. The Russians refused to fight. This was not what Napoleon had planned for. His entire strategy depended on finding the Russian army, forcing a decisive engagement, destroying it in a single great battle, and using that destruction to compel the Tsar to negotiate. But the Russians simply were not there. Every time Napoleon pushed forward, the Russian armies melted away in front of him, retreating, always retreating. Into the forests, into the steppe, deeper into the vast emptiness of a country that seemed to have no end. And as they retreated, they burned. This was not panic. This was not cowardice. This was the deliberate, systematic implementation of a strategy that had been debated at the highest levels of the Russian military command. The man behind it was General Mikhail Illarionovich Kutuzov, 67 years old, heavy, slow-moving, half-blind in his right eye from a Turkish musket ball he had taken decades earlier. A man who seemed, to Western observers, almost comically unsuited to commanding an army in the field. Napoleon himself had never respected him. After a previous defeat Kutuzov had suffered, Napoleon reportedly joked that the old man was finished. Kutuzov was not finished. He had studied Napoleon for years. He understood the Frenchman's genius better than almost anyone alive. And he understood something crucial that Napoleon did not, that Russia's greatest weapon was not its army. It was its size, its emptiness, its climate, and its capacity to simply absorb punishment until the attacker destroyed himself.
Every village that burned was one less place for French soldiers to sleep. Every granary destroyed was tons of food that the Grande Armée would not eat. Every bridge demolished was another day of delay, another day of marching, another day of attrition. The strategy had a name. The Russians called it scorched earth, and it was working. By August, Napoleon's army had been marching for nearly 2 months. They had covered almost 800 kilometers. They had fought a handful of small engagements, but nothing decisive. And they were not the same army that had crossed the Niemen in June. Disease had killed thousands. The brutal summer heat had killed more. Men fell out of the columns from exhaustion and were left behind. Horses died at an alarming rate. Supply lines stretched so thin that entire divisions were receiving a fraction of their required food. The Grande Armée that would fight the decisive battle Napoleon had been promising was already smaller, already weaker, already quietly falling apart, before the real fighting had even begun. That fighting came on the 7th of September, 1812. On a field outside a small town called Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. Kutuzov had finally chosen to stand and fight, not because he thought he could win, he had no illusions about that, but because the Russian public, the Russian aristocracy, and above all Tsar Alexander himself were demanding that Moscow be defended, that the army stop running and show the French something. What they showed them was something extraordinary in its violence. 150,000 men on each side, 250,000 total packed onto a field roughly 6 miles wide, 700 cannons firing simultaneously at ranges close enough to see individual faces. From 6 in the morning until darkness fell, 12 hours of continuous combat at an intensity that shocked men who had fought in every major engagement of the previous decade. The French attacked the Russian defensive positions. Earthwork, fortifications called flèches, and the great Zhaevsky battery in the center. Over and over again, each time they took a position, the Russians counterattacked and took it back. Each time the counterattack failed, the Russians simply reformed and attacked again. There was no elegance to it, no clever maneuver, no brilliant tactical stroke, just mass and will, and the willingness to absorb terrible punishment without breaking. The Russian artillery, heavier, better positioned and superbly handled, inflicted casualties that veteran French officers later described as unlike anything they had ever experienced. The ground, one French general wrote that evening, was literally carpeted with bodies. By the end of the day, 75,000 men were dead or wounded, nearly 40,000 of them French. Napoleon had won. Technically, Kutuzov withdrew during the night, leaving the field to the French. By the rules of 18th century warfare, that made it a French victory. But Napoleon knew, and the expression on his face as he surveyed the battlefield that evening told his marshals everything. That this was not the victory he had needed. The Russian army still existed. It had retreated, yes, but it had not been destroyed. It had not been shattered. It had absorbed everything he threw at it, inflicted terrible losses in return, and walked away, largely intact. He needed to destroy the army. He had merely pushed it back. 2 weeks later, on September 14th, Napoleon Bonaparte rode into Moscow at the head of his army. He expected a delegation, city officials bearing the keys of the city, an offer of terms, the beginning of negotiations. The streets were empty, not quiet the way a city is quiet at dawn, empty, completely, disturbingly, totally abandoned. Nearly all of Moscow's 250,000 residents had fled in the days before the French arrived. The streets were littered with abandoned furniture, clothing, overturned carts. The silence was, by multiple accounts, deeply unsettling. And then, in the early hours of that first night, the fires began. The Russians had left behind a network of agents with orders to destroy everything of value. Within 48 hours, 3/4 of Moscow was burning. The fire raged for 6 days. When it was finally over, most of the city, including most of the supplies and shelter Napoleon had counted on, was ash and rubble. Napoleon sat in the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to contact him. The Tsar never did. Days passed, then weeks. Napoleon sent 3 separate diplomatic messages. 2 were simply ignored. One received a response so brief and so contemptuous that his diplomats were not sure whether to deliver it or destroy it. Alexander had decided, with the calm, almost eerie clarity of a man who had finally found his resolve, that there would be no negotiation. Not now, not from a burned city, not while a single French soldier remained on Russian soil. He would wait. Winter was coming. And Napoleon, for perhaps the first time in his military career, genuinely did not know what to do next. He stayed in Moscow for 35 days. His officers grew increasingly uneasy. His supply situation deteriorated by the week. The Cossack cavalry that operated freely in the countryside around the city systematically destroyed any French foraging party that ventured more than a few miles from the gates. His army was slowly starving in the ruins of a city it had captured but could not eat. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon gave the order to withdraw. The retreat from Moscow is not a military story. It is something older and more terrible than that. It is a story about what happens when an army, any army, no matter how well trained, no matter how experienced, no matter how legendarily tough, is placed beyond the limits of what human bodies can endure. The temperature on the day they left Moscow was already below freezing. It dropped further and further. By November, it had fallen to -30 degrees Celsius in some areas. Men who lay down to sleep did not always wake up. Men who fell behind the column were never seen again. The route they followed was the same road they had marched east on in the summer, which meant there was nothing left on it. Every village burned, every granary empty, every bridge damaged or destroyed. The Grande Armée marched through a wasteland of its own making, starving and freezing in a landscape it had already destroyed. And the Russians followed. Kutuzov's army pursued from the south. Cossack cavalry units, fast, ruthless, and intimately familiar with the terrain, attacked the flanks of the retreating column day and night, picking off stragglers, destroying supply wagons, preventing the French from ever stopping long enough to properly rest or reorganize. It was not a pursuit. It was a slow, methodical execution. Officers who survived wrote that the road east of Smolensk was lined for miles in both directions with the frozen bodies of French soldiers. Men who had marched 10,000 miles in Napoleon's service survived Austerlitz and Jena and Borodino and died by the side of a Russian road within sight of the army they had been part of. Of the 680,000 men who had crossed the Niemen River into Russia 6 months earlier, fewer than 90,000 crossed back out. Napoleon did not witness most of this. On December 5th, still deep in Russian territory, he handed command of the army to Marshal Murat and stepped into a closed carriage. He needed to reach Paris before the news did. There were things to manage: his image, his political position, the conscription of new armies to replace the one he had lost. He reached Paris on December 18th, traveling under a false name, moving as quickly as the roads would allow. The remnants of the Grande Armée, frostbitten, hollowed out, barely recognizable as soldiers, staggered out of Russia over the following weeks. Russia had not just survived Napoleon. What happened next made clear that it had broken him. Within months, Prussia switched sides, then Austria. the coalition that had feared Napoleon for a decade suddenly realized that the fear had been misplaced, or at least that the price of continuing to fear him was now higher than the price of fighting him. By the spring of 1814, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and British armies were closing in on Paris from 3 directions. Napoleon fought brilliantly in that final campaign. Some historians consider it his most tactically impressive, but it was not enough. On March 31st, 1814, Russian troops entered Paris. Tsar Alexander I rode into the city on horseback. The man Napoleon had called weak, the man who had refused to negotiate from a burning city, the man who had simply waited, through the winter, through the chaos, through the political pressure to compromise, until the waiting paid off. He rode through the streets of the French capital, at the head of the most powerful army on the continent. Napoleon abdicated 4 days later. He was exiled to the island of Elba. He came back, of course. That was Napoleon. That was always Napoleon. But Waterloo followed, and then a second exile, this time to the island of St. Helena in the remote South Atlantic, where he lived out the remaining 6 years of his life in an exile so complete that even correspondence was difficult. He died in 1821. Some said of stomach cancer. Others, then and now, have suggested something more deliberate. The island was far from France, and the British, who controlled it, had very good reasons to ensure he never returned. Russia, meanwhile, emerged from 1812, transformed. What had been a war for survival became something else. Proof that Russia was not a European backwater, not a half-Asian curiosity on the fringes of civilization, but a world power of the first order. The country that had eaten Napoleon's greatest army had earned the right to sit at the table where Europe's future was decided. Tsar Alexander was celebrated across the continent as the liberator of Europe. Russian culture experienced a flowering of national identity. The war against Napoleon became central to Russian self-understanding in a way that has never entirely faded. And the lesson of 1812 was written into the country's bones. Russia is vast. Russia is patient. Russia does not negotiate from a position of weakness, and Russia, when pushed far enough, is capable of absorbing losses that would destroy any other nation, and still being there when the storm passes. Napoleon learned this too late, and Russia never, ever forgot it.